Okay, let's get rolling. Good morning, welcome back. I hope that you had a safe trip from wherever you might have been traveling for Thanksgiving break. I know the weather has been pretty dicey over the last couple of days, and there are a few folks who are joining us remotely due to the weather. So do what you need to stay safe. Again, if you're not able to safely come to class, just send me an email and I'll give you the Zoom link for that class meeting. Also, we're coming up into the last 2 weeks of the term. So we have 6 more class meetings, including this one. We're not meeting for the final exam period, but we will have a final exam for you to do on Canvas. So we're getting pretty close to the finish line. Also, there's a lot of nasty bugs going around. So if you've got a cough or you're feeling sick or not great, help us all out and request to join remotely if you're not feeling good. Okay. So it's been a minute. For a lot of you, we didn't meet since the Wednesday before break, since we had that optional workshop on Friday. So I do want to help us kind of get back in the swing of things. Again, I hope you had a great break. I was down in the Salt Lake City area for my extended family. We played a lot of Smash Bros. We had some good Thanksgiving food. It's a lot of fun. So to get us started and thinking again about this course, let's go way back and work through this practice question. So according to Blank, our relationships can be defined in terms of contradiction or the ways that we feel pulls in either directions. The family systems theory, exchange theory, co-cultural theory, or relational dialectics theory. I'll give you a minute or two to think about this, get some of the rust off, and we'll talk about this question together. Anybody who would like some more time on this question? All right, let's talk about it together. How many people think A, family system theory? It's not. We'll talk about that a bit later this week. B, exchange theory. C, co-cultural theory. Or D, relational dialectics theory. How many people are not sure? Okay, so a lot of you. So the best answer here is relational dialectics theory. One easy way to remember this is if you see the term dialectics, dia, is short for a lot of terms, such as dialogue. So if we think about dialogue between two people, dialectic is similar. It's two kind of opposing or discussing forces, such as ideal versus real, freedom versus security, and so on. Maybe if you're hearing some of those things, some more of that is coming up. So relational dialectics theory is about how we're managing those types of tensions in our relationship. We want to feel really close and connected to other people, but we will also want to feel independent and like we can do our own thing. So this idea that we are competing between those different demands best defines relational dialectics theory. So this is a good way for you to help kind of come back into the course, since we do have the final exam that'll be on Canvas between December 12th to 14th. Talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. So we had an optional workshop day, but before that, before the break, we talked about strategies of relationships and some of the ways that we use communication to engage in relationships. And we're going to be building on some of those ideas as we head into these final 2 weeks. In particular, we'll be talking about friendships for today and how friendships develop through communication, the different stages of friendships, and some of the challenges of effective friendship relationships. We'll be moving on to look at marriage and family relationships a bit more as we get into Wednesday and Friday. Again, useful tools for us to have when we think about communication and something we're constantly doing, right? Communication is exciting because we're always using it in our lives, so we can think about ways to become better at our communication. We'll also be talking a little bit more about the recording and reflection essay. You should see grades on all of those for those of you who turned in those essays. So those have been graded. If you do not see comments yet, I'm in the process of finalizing, drafting and writing out comments. So you should be seeing those by the end of the week. So for the remaining classes at a glance, we have 2 more Canvas prompts. So if you still need to meet those 6, there's 1 Canvas prompt that you can turn in by this Sunday, and then the final Canvas prompt that you can turn in by December 11th. Remember, you only need 6, and if you do more than 6, then your lowest 7th and 8th scores will be dropped. So I only grade your top 6 best Canvas prompts. I prioritize grading your essays. So if you're still waiting for your grades on those Canvas prompts, you should see those by the end of this week. So we'll be talking about friendship, family communication, and family relationships this week. And then next week will be our final set of new content. We'll be looking at interpersonal communication in the workplace and some of the negative patterns and what some have called the dark side of communication that can happen as well. So that'll be our last new content. Similar to previously, we'll use December 9th, our last class meeting, as a chance to wrap up the course and prepare for the final exam. So we're not meeting face-to-face for the final exam period because I know a lot of you are traveling by then. The final exam is just like the midterm exam, and that you take it on Canvas. You get a 3-day window to take it. It's 2 hours to complete it once you choose to open it. 25 multiple choice questions, 4 choose 3 short essay questions. And similarly, I will be giving you a study guide and practice questions by Wednesday's class. So you'll have access to those to help you to prepare. The final exam primarily covers material after the midterm, but again, it's cumulative in the sense that everything we've been talking about in the class builds off of itself, right? We need to understand a communication model to understand how people communicate in the workplace. So I do encourage you to refresh your earlier notes in the course, but do prioritize the new content that we've discussed since the midterm exam. I also want to make you aware that all of the remaining assignments of the course, if you have anything that you need to turn in late or that's missing, needs to be turned in by December 14th. That is the hard cutoff where I have to submit grades to the registrar's office. So just know that that date is the end of the course. And outside of it incomplete, that would be when you need to get all of that stuff in. I also wanted to let you know about an extra credit opportunity, right? So I give extra credit in the course. If you complete it, it adds 20 points or 2% on to your final grade. So I'm also teaching a course called Communication and Social Change this term. And we're very, very lucky to have Oregon Rural Action, which is an Eastern Oregon-based nonprofit that does a lot of advocacy work related to rural issues and topics in the region. So ORA is going to be presenting in this COM 310 course between 1 to 2:50 on Wednesday, December 7th. So what I'm asking you to do is if you'd like to complete this extra credit, you're welcome to attend. They'll be doing it face-to-face, but there'll also be a Zoom link for you to attend remotely. If you say, oh no, I have another class or practice at this time, that's okay, because that presentation is going to be recorded. I'll be uploading that presentation if you need to access that at a later time too. So what I'll be asking you to do is to either attend face-to-face through Zoom or watch the recording. Complete a write-up based on what you noticed and what stood out to you from that presentation. And then that will add those points if you fully address that problem. We're still finalizing the room. It should be a larger room in this area on campus. So I will let you know once we get that locked in. So I would just mark your calendar for December 7th from 1 to 2:50 if you can make it and are interested in doing the extra credit, or plan to watch the recording if you can. So all of the recording and reflection essays that have been turned in have been graded, and I wanted to give you the chance to offer feedback and some general things that I noticed about this assignment to help you to prepare and kind of discern some of the things you can do for future essays and projects going forward. So the first thing I want to highlight is there are several essays that are still missing. So if you did not turn in your recording and reflection essay, you do not have a very easy window to pass the class, because the recording and reflection essay is 20% of the grade in the course, right? So that would mean that the highest possible grade that you could receive is an 80% if you did 100% on everything. So it's a very small margin of error, right? Late assignments can be turned in for -5% for each day something is late. So you can still get some degree of partial credit, and I highly encourage you to do that if you still have not turned in your essay. Again, I can look at that for partial credit. I can give you a bit of a buffer in order to help. That translates to 10 days or 10 points for each day something is late. So please make an effort to turn that in, or reach out to me if you're having trouble related to that. I also want to highlight that while a lot of essays did a great job of including the things that they needed, there were some issues and points were docked in cases in which essays were missing one of the 3 parts, right? So the listing of the assignment on Canvas, as well as the rubric, identified that there are 3 things that you needed. That is the essay itself, the transcription, right, which is the written version of the conversation between you and that other person, and the inclusion of both works cited and in-text citations. There were some essays that did not include any in-text citations. Thankfully, I did not encounter cases where essays lacked a works cited or the inclusion of the APA, MLA, or Chicago site of the textbook. So thank you for including that. Overall, those were formatted well and look good. But please, please, please make sure you're including the in-text citations in future, since that impacted people's scores. Again, the transcription was something missing from a few assignments that was the written version of your conversation that you recorded. One thing that I think people did really well was identifying some major ideas or concepts from the course. For example, some people looked at the different steps of the listening process. Some people looked at different conversation styles. That was a pretty common one. But the ability to identify and include different terms from the course, I think, was really good. And I think a lot of people chose a really interesting situation and explained that really well. For example, maybe you're talking to a long distance partner about your favorite character in a TV show, or maybe you're talking to your parents about what it's been like in the term so far. I think people did a great job of explaining the scenario and presenting that in a clear way. One thing that I encourage folks to continue to work on is applying and defining some of the major concepts in the course, right? This is where including the in-text citations and references is a really good idea. There were some times where an essay would include a term, for example, talking about people-oriented listeners without fully explaining what that term was or how that term could be applied and situated in that conversation. And at times, the inclusion of some terms and ideas was a bit vague and not fully developed. So continue to use kind of the rich applications and examples to develop those points a bit more and substantiate the content of your essay. If you have any concerns or questions for me about the grade that you received and would like to discuss that further, set up a meeting with me or visit me in office hours, and I'm happy to discuss that further with you. Any questions on anything we talked about last class? Anything more generally before we get into some of the new stuff for today? Awesome. Let's get rolling. So this week we are looking at friendships and family relationships. We've talked a lot about communication, conversations, and listening, and I think it's useful for us to apply and look at how these elements of communication play out in a lot of specific scenarios. So when we think about what makes a friend, right, and how we define friendships in our lives, oftentimes it's something we know when we see it, right? We know who our friends are, though at times we find ourselves in an odd in-between space where we're not really sure if somebody's a friend or not. Maybe it's somebody you started talking to on a team, or maybe it's somebody that you're just getting to know, right? So a friendship is defined by a lot of different parts, but generally speaking, studies have suggested that there are 5 main things that make up friendships and how we can define friendships in our own lives. One of them is the idea that friendships are voluntary. While circumstance and situation might bring us towards certain people, like you get to know somebody on a team that you otherwise never meet, or your student here at EOU to make friends with other students, this idea is that we're choosing to make friends specifically because we're going outside of the general roles that we have with that person, right? So you have the opportunity to come to class and sit next to somebody, and that's part of your defined role, but you're choosing to hang out with them, talk to them, do stuff with them outside of that context. So your decision to talk to somebody in the hall outside of class is a voluntary component of a friendship. A friendship is personal, right? We feel a specific friendship and connection between different people. That a friendship is not a parasocial relationship, right? So oftentimes celebrities will address fans or create content for fans. That wouldn't be the personal element because it's not specifically directed to you. The negotiation and dynamic element that you and another person encounter, perhaps in your essay, is an example of this personal element. So equality is something that a lot of friendships have. And this idea of the spirit of equality, I think, is a good way of thinking about this. Because not every friendship is equal in every situation, right? There's not going to be an even one-to-one ratio of the amount of time you and the other person talk. There are going to be times where things are a bit lopsided. Maybe your friend is dealing with a difficult transition, moving away from home, and they need some extra support. So this idea is that overall, a friendship is designed to mutually help other people. You might think back to exchange theory and the idea that oftentimes we choose friendships that we feel are worthwhile and outweigh the costs. They're mutual, right? Generally speaking, if somebody considers you a friend, you think the same of them. And if not, then it would not be considered a friendship. And then there's this idea of affect, right? Affect is dealing with an emotional or instantaneous response to something. So if you receive some really exciting news, like you find out that a relative is having a baby and you have this kind of shocked expression, that's affect. That is your emotional response to something. And this idea is that when we're in a friendship, we experience affect. If you were visiting family and friends over the holidays, there's a good chance that you were smiling, you were happy, you had some type of affective response to seeing people again after a while, which fits under that part of friendships too. So we know it when we see it, but generally speaking, these parts characterize a friendship in our communication. Another thing that I think is important for us to circle back to is the role of interpersonal communication competence. To be a competent or emotionally intelligent communicator, we have to consider the situation, the roles, and what our goals are. So if you were traveling over the break, you were probably spending time to catch up with people, to spend time with people, to learn about how their experiences have been going so far. And catching up and learning about friends that you didn't spend as much time with was probably a major goal. And you probably used a variety of behaviors to do that. You asked questions, you sat down and maybe got coffee with a friend, you chose to travel and maybe brave some of the challenging weather to do that. So you used a variety of strategies to get those goals. So as we're navigating friendships, we're making choices about how our communication is shaping those relationships. Again, communication is the basis of disclosure, of understanding, of sharing. And so we're agentically using that communication to create and maintain friendships. Again, this idea of a dialectic refers to a dialogue, right? Or these two different extremes that are in conversation with one another that shape the way that we communicate. So when it comes to friendships, we can think about dialectics in two different camps. One of them is based on context. You might think back to our discussion of culture and the difference between a low and high context culture, right? A low context culture, people say what they mean, there's very little subtext. A high context culture, there is a lot of nuance and subtlety in facial expressions and nonverbal communication. And in the same way, the context or the culture or situation is a factor that shapes how our friendships play out. For instance, one element is the idea of private versus public. How much of ourselves do we choose to disclose and share about among our friends? For instance, the discussion of mental health in some cultures and contexts might be stigmatized and not talked about, and in other cultures and contexts might be more open and shared freely among people in the friendship. So we oscillate in our self-disclosure and sharing based on what we consider to be appropriate for the situation. We also need to consider ideal versus ideal. Again, this is a dialectic that deals with how we want things to be, including in the context of our relationship, versus how things might actually be or play out in our relationship. So for instance, we might really want to spend more time with a friend that we have distance from, but we're reconciling that with the geographic constraints and challenges that we might have in negotiating that relationship, right? So we deal with that as shaping our interactions, but we also tend to think about the choices that we make within our friendships, which would be what would be considered an interactional dialectic. One of them deals with this idea of independence versus dependence. So one example is if you have a roommate, do you study together, do you work together, or do you generally do your own thing? Do you have a lot of shared common space, or do you have like a line of tape that's separating you two to make sure that you're not encroaching on each other's space? So that's one factor that we can consider. Another is affection versus instrumentality, right? Affection would generally refer to relationships in which we value and want to be with the person, regardless of whether or not being around that person is personally beneficial to us, right? So it might be a big drain on our lives, physically and mentally, to spend time with a person dealing with a difficult situation, but we love and we value them, and as a result, we're willing to do that. Instrumentality is the more Machiavellian approach, right? That says that we view friendships as achieving something that we want. So maybe you're in a class and you try to make a friend because you know you want somebody that will take notes for you, and vice versa when you're gone. So sometimes we choose friendships on the basis of instrumentality, especially in a professional or work context. There's also this idea of judgment versus acceptance. On the one end, right, we are oftentimes judging or evaluating other people in a friendship. Maybe they're wearing an outfit or they've made a decision that we disagree with. And we have to reconcile that with our desire to accept them and support the decisions that they make, even if they're not the ones that we would choose to make. And then lastly, there's this idea of expressiveness versus protectiveness. On the one end, we choose to express, disclose, and share details about our lives. We want to be open with other people. But on the other, there might be private and personal details about our lives, about our relationships, and so on, that we don't want to share with them as well. So in our friendships, we're using communication as a way to negotiate these constraints that are impacted both by our culture and situation, but also impacted by the dynamics of the friendship and the way that the friendship is playing out. So you might think back to the 10 stages of relationships, 5 of coming together, 5 of coming apart. And somewhat similarly, we see that friendships generally go through a variety of different stages, right? So I'll give you one example of a good friend that I had in kindergarten through 3rd grade, a friend named Max. So early on, right? We find ourselves in what's known as role-delineated interaction. Again, this would be something like being in a class, and you have a classmate, and you don't need to talk to them or interact with them outside of class. So you're just communicating with them in that specific constraint. So when I was in kindergarten and first grade, right, I had a classmate named Max. We sat together a bunch, but we started out by just communicating in the context of our class. Then we start to move toward friendly relations. Generally speaking, that's when conversation starts, right? We tend to talk to that person and make an effort to get to know that person. So maybe you're attending a new meeting or a new club, right? And you're sitting next to somebody that you haven't met and you choose to get to know that person. That would be an example of starting to create that type of friendly engagement with that person. A move toward friendship means that you were really making an agentic effort to get to know and engage with somebody as a friend. So oftentimes in that context, you started to identify, this person seems cool, this person seems like somebody I want to get to know better. And you might choose to ask more questions, you might spend additional time with them, you might start to move out of the situations when you normally speak to them, to maybe talk to them after class, or walk back to your cars together, and so on. A nascent friendship refers to a friendship in some of the early stages. So at that point, you might start to hang out with that person, you might start to message that person, you might start to exchange information with each other. So at that stage, you are beginning to spend time with somebody and getting to know who that person is, right? In my case, my friend at that stage was interested in getting to know me, asking questions, and starting to organize times that we can spend together. In a stabilized friendship, we find ourselves at a point where our friends are really well established and are a really key aspect of our lives. At this stage, we find that we can count on our friends. We know that they're going to follow up with us and support us. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're instantly responding to text or messaging, right? But the idea is that based on when they choose to contact us, that we know that we can count on them and have them around, right? With a lot of close friends and people you've really gotten to know well, there's a good chance that you might have gaps in your communication, but you know that you're always coming back to talk to them and spend time with them. So a stabilized friendship would be somebody who you really consider to be in your corner. One thing that a lot of us encounter, again, moving into college and moving through the context of COVID-19 has been the challenges of waning friendships, right? Sometimes people just drift apart. After my good friend Max moved to Eugene, we exchanged emails with each other, but eventually we really started to end contact with each other and just didn't have the same interactions because we weren't engaging face-to-face anymore. A lot of people have expressed the same challenges, right? People are moving on to college and you might have a network of people you know from high school, but you're finding that you're at different stages in your life, you're doing different things and you don't connect the same way. Or maybe under COVID, you haven't had the chance to connect with people. Not all friendships move to this stage. Again, a lot of people stay at a stabilized friendship, but some friendships do drift apart. And then we have this idea of a post-friendship. You wouldn't really consider somebody to be your friend anymore, but you do have a lot of memories and association with that person. So for instance, whenever I see a beaded gecko, I remember my friend Max because we like to make those like plastic bead geckos together, right? And that was a whole lot of fun. And whenever I see one of those, it elicits that memory of that previous friendship. So again, it's not a totally linear path. Friendships can rekindle and change over time. And not all friendships develop in a stabilized fashion, but it's a useful framework for us to think about how communication is shaping the development of friendships through things such as self-disclosure. We also have this idea of different styles of friendships. We can think about this as what we choose to do in order to engage in friendships with other people. This is one part of your Canvas activity for this week, so it's a good thing to know and understand pretty well here. And friendship styles might be independent, right? So in an independent friendship style, generally speaking, we have a difficult time naming people that we're not currently friends with. A good example of this is choosing based on circumstances in life who you're friends with. Maybe it's somebody in class that you've chosen to be a study partner with. Maybe it's somebody that's on your athletic team with whom you started to form a connection. Oftentimes in these situations, right, we look to people that we might make friends with that make sense given the situation and issues that we find ourselves in, right? Social creatures, we have the survival instinct to form connections with other people on the basis of helping to develop our relationships. We also have this idea of acquisitive, right? Or of developing and acquiring friendships based on the idea that they enrich our lives and help us to build our relationships. In this way, a lot of people are actively seeking and trying to form connections with other people, right? This idea that if you're a more social person, you oftentimes like creating new friends and meeting new people for that reason. One good example of this are a lot of apps that are designed for friendship. In fact, a lot of dating apps such as OkCupid and Bumble, right, typically include versions that are designed to be platonic and to make friends. And a lot of people have used those apps who've had difficulty with finding ways to make friends in other contexts. Things such as Bumble BFF are examples of how people might use the acquisitive style to actively seek out and develop new friendships with other people. And then there is this idea of discerning, in which we're really interested in using friendships to make a deep commitment and engagement with somebody else. You don't just want to make friends, you want to make best friends. You want to have people in your life with whom you're really close and are really able to support, right? A lot of times people who are interested in developing a sense of community and engagement with each other are people who are interested in the more discerning style of friendship, right? So you can think about these friendship styles as what choices we make and what ways we choose to engage in friendships with other people. And I'll be asking you for this week's prompt to reflect on which styles you're more likely to use in how you develop friendships. We also have a 2x2 quadrant that goes over some of the different types of friendships that we can experience, right? And I think it's funny because like the book uses a different visual thing each time. Sometimes they're like circles and ovals, sometimes they're lines like this one. But I do think that it's useful for us to understand this both in the terms of healthy versus unhealthy and enjoyable versus unenjoyable, right? So over here, we have a friendship that's both enjoyable, both sides like being in that friendship, and is healthy. So in that situation, people feel like they enjoy spending time with somebody, they feel a connection to that person, and they feel like people are able to mutually support each other. So if you have a good friend in high school who helped you with studying and preparing, maybe you threw your hats up in the air when you graduated, that might be a good example here of an ideal friendship. We also have friendships that are waning, right? That are healthy. There's nothing wrong going on between you two, but it just doesn't feel the same way that it did before. Maybe your interests and topics that you like to talk about are different. Maybe you're having more difficulty connecting. Maybe they've gone in a very different direction in life. There's just something that's off about that friendship. Not harmful, but just off. There's what's known as a problematic friendship, right? And that's a friendship that is enjoyable, but is not necessarily healthy. Again, I grew up in a household of therapists, and they like to tell me that people get addicted to drama, right? Oftentimes, people enjoy the emotional highs and lows. They enjoy getting heat up. They enjoy having some type of emotional or affective response to something, even if it's not necessarily great, right? Studies suggest that people do get some degree of pleasure and joy out of escalation, even if you were to ask them in that moment and say, no, I don't enjoy conflict, I don't enjoy fighting, right? We look at, for example, a lot of explosive dynamics and relationships in film and television. Those are examples of problematic friendships and relationships that play out. I recently finished the most recent season of Bachelor in Paradise, and it's trash, right? But there's a lot of examples of toxic, problematic friendships that are happening, right? Where people are openly interpersonally hostile to each other, right? So healthy, unhealthy but enjoyable friendship where you're perhaps really hurtful or disrespectful to other people, right? I'm the problem, it's me. That's a problematic friendship. And then you have a deviant friendship. And that's a weird case because it's neither enjoyable nor healthy. And you might be wondering, well, why would people choose to do that? Well, people might choose a deviant friendship because there's history in that friendship. For example, maybe there's a friendship that started positive, but it got really toxic and hurtful over time. Sometimes people think that they're not worthy of having a better or more enjoyable or healthy friendship, or perhaps by circumstance, people find themselves in situations where a deviant friendship plays out. These are not necessarily happy, but they do happen. And oftentimes people are dealing with some major issues in their life that impact these friendships continuing to happen the way that they do. So one of the last ideas that I want to get at here is another difference in terms of thinking about relationships that are either communal or agentic, right? Again, we can think about the history of gender in the context of communication, and what studies tell us, right, is that social and cultural norms, values tend to have a much bigger change and impact on our communication rather than biology, right? The stereotype and the general trope is that men tend to be more interested in agentic friendships, doing activities, while women tend to be more interested in communal friendships that are more about self-disclosure and emotional communication and support. This is not necessarily the case, as we notice a lot of friendships across genders in which there's significant difference. But if we think about gender as a product of culture and the way that culture develops our senses of gender, we think about roles and the assignment of roles and norms. And oftentimes, right, the types of friendships that we find ourselves in tend to be gendered on that basis. So oftentimes, the segregation of individuals on the basis of gender growing up through activities, participation has led to a lot of the differences that we might notice here. So again, a communal friendship is one in which there's a greater emphasis on working with that person to disclose, to share, and to build intimacy through conversation. Whereas an agentic friendship tends to be a greater focus on using activities as a way of gaining support with other people, right? I noticed, for instance, that some of the members of my partner's extended family, like her dad, he's a physics professor who loves to talk, he loves to ask questions and pry and probe, right? Very kind of communal in his style. But my partner's brothers, who I played Smash Bros with a bunch, are much more agentic, right? They use activities as a way of bonding with each other. So oftentimes we find the easiest way to communicate is when we share this overlap with each other. Either we see similarities in either communal or agentic communication between the two people. And oftentimes it can be a greater challenge to develop relationships with people who might gravitate toward different ways of expressing their friendship with each other. Lastly, before we do an activity for today, I want to hit on some of the challenges that we may start to think about when we're engaging with friendships with other people, right? I gave an example earlier in the term of the film Justin Timberlake and Mila Kunis, Friends with Benefits, right? This term, this concept, this idea of people where, you know, you're sexually involved, but you're just friends and you're not developing a relationship. That's emerged as a somewhat newer term and way of characterizing relationships. In many ways, complicates and blurs the boundaries of friendships and relationships. One of the things your book hits on as well is the idea that oftentimes, if a friendship involves people of a gender of which they are attracted to, right, there are challenges in negotiating the relationship with potential feelings of sexual attraction or intimacy between people, right? There are a lot of examples in the past that I think are very antiquated and incorrect. For example, if you ever watched the old romantic comedy When Harry Met Sally, there's an infamous line about how, according to one of the characters in that film, men and women can't be friends, right? Which has obviously been discredited in a lot of different ways. For instance, individuals in the LGBTQ community might not feel a sense of sexual attraction or intimacy in that way among friendships of different genders. There are a lot of cases in which attraction is not necessarily felt, or if it is not acted upon in that way, right? So that's one of the challenges and things to think about, is some of the ways in which friendship relationships might be impacted by feelings of attraction, right? And the challenge that I think we oftentimes have with coding and understanding platonic friendships, including platonic same-sex friendships, when we're not given the same vocabulary for those, right? I think it's been interesting to see terminology in recent years. For instance, men who might be friends and refer to each other as bros, right, has become something more commonly used to develop a vocabulary for platonic friendships that might not otherwise exist, right? I think it's interesting that oftentimes girlfriends might be used in a platonic way, but you don't typically see the same when men talk about boyfriends. We assume that that's sexual or romantic. We might also think about technology and the ways that technology changes the way that we communicate, as well as culture and gender, right? We've talked a little bit about how individuals across different cultures or genders might come in with different norms, different expectations of the relationship, and different ways of choosing to disclose and share parts of their relationships with other people. So given that, what I would like you to do is to take some time to find a group somewhere between 3 and 5 people. I'd like you to have one person in your group who can take some notes and include the names of everybody in your group. And what I'd like you to do is to just take some time to discuss and jot down some of the themes and ideas that you're noticing among your group. In particular, take some time to share how you're using technology in your friendships, how you know when somebody has become your friend, what clues you in about that stage. And you might think about some of the changes that you've seen over time, such as COVID-19, such as moving away or spending time somewhere else for college. And as you're noticing and sharing these things, have one person in your group who is noticing some common themes. So I'll give you some time to share and jot down some of the things that you're noticing here. And if you're on Zoom on your own, I'll ask you to take some notes for yourself and email those to me.
All right. I didn't know what one of your
So I'll give you 2 more minutes. Sounds like most groups moved on to the third question. We'll be asking somebody from each group to share. So you might take some time to figure out who might want to do that. All right. Go ahead and finish up. Let's take some time to share some of the things you might have noticed in talking amongst your groups. So let's hear from the group here on this side about this first question. So how did you notice that your group is using technology to create and maintain your friendship?
Well, we said like keeping close one another, kind of a lot of attention to other people on social media, like keeping impact, like whether it's Snapchat, other apps, or like Facebook, all of the social media apps.
Right. So one thing that happens is when we have people we're friends with, maybe on social media, we're not necessarily direct messaging them all the time, right? Sometimes we're maintaining our relationships through engagement with each other's activity. For example, there's a good chance if you use Facebook and your good friends use Facebook, that they're probably going to like or maybe comment a lot of your activity, posts, updates, and so on. It's kind of a way of checking in and showing that you still care about them and the things going on in their lives, even if you're not directly messaging them in that moment. It's always interesting to see who's the first to respond, right? Or there's oftentimes a lot of memes and jokes where it's like you do @ in the search and your number 2 has to buy you food if they don't reply in a half hour. There's silly stuff like that that people use. But the engagement with social media is a common way that even though the message isn't directed toward them, they're in that inner circle and they can respond and engage with content on that basis. Let's hear from the middle group with regard to what kind of indicates with somebody being your friend. What generally emerges to show that you've reached that state with somebody else?
So when you start seeing the other person more often, they're sharing more intimate details about yourself, being more open to talk about things, just not really holding back what you say.
Right. So openness, self-disclosure really shapes that process. Again, we can think back to uncertainty reduction, social penetration, and a lot of different theories that have discussed this process of self-disclosure, that the more personal, significant details of our lives that we share with that person, the closer we feel with that person, or the more comfortable we feel as well. And how about here on this side about the ways that friendships have been impacted by change? What were some of the things that you all noticed?
You can't physically hang out people as much like that you used to. There's not as much communication and
Right. So the lack of face-to-face engagement does make things more challenging, right? We do have, we have email, we have texting, we have other ways of engaging with that person. But as we've been talking about over the course of this class, there's so much of our communication that's nonverbal and that's transmitted through something like a face-to-face encounter that you're not getting the same level of depth, explanation, and presence online in that way. So if that starts to be the only way you communicate with somebody, that's a lot more challenging, and you might find that things drift over time, or you're just not getting the same fulfillment out of that relationship. So I appreciate your observations here with regard to our relationships and friendships over time. To wrap up for today, I encourage you to look again at that calendar in our remaining class meetings to help you prepare for these last couple weeks. We talked a bit about friendships in our communication. On Wednesday, we'll be looking at family communication, and also I'll be giving you the study guide for the final exam. Please make sure that your group member names are on the work that you did for today, and either pass forward or email that to me. Enjoy whatever the heck is happening out there, the blizzard, flurry, all that fun stuff. Stay safe, take care of yourself, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Yeah, thank you.